Hello friends, as has been announced by the organizing unit of the series, today we start a new lecture series called the 19th century short fiction, and in this fiction we plan to introduce you to a form which is old as well as new. Old in the sense that human beings always started using the short story in order to communicate certain intent at that point of time, and when that happened no one knows. But in the form in which we discuss the short story emerged specifically in the 19th century. So the title of the series is the 19th century short fiction. I refer particularly to the printed word. Earlier it must have been a folk tale. One doesn't know. We have the expert Dr. Etchy Bates to tell us about this and the associated things. But in this form that we read the short story today in the 20th and 21st centuries emerged largely in the 19th century, with the printing word taking over the region of communication in human relations. So what the short story is, how it is different from the novel, the long fiction, the longer fiction, what is its identity, what are its characteristics, whether it's a genre, whether it's a form. All these questions will be introduced at the basic level today, because this being the first lecture in the series, and already I have in a way mapped the points that are there to emerge in the discussion. So straight away I request Dr. Etchy Bates, who teaches English in Hindu College, University of Delhi in the English department. So she is with us to introduce this particular series in the form in which we plan to present it. So Dr. Etchy Bates, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Anand Prakash. I would, as you said, I would only like to introduce today the short story form and how we can distinguish it from, say, the novel. Now, that the basic question that emerges out of this entire discussion would be whether the short story is only different from the novel in terms of its size, whether it's just about the number of pages and the number of words that the short story has that makes it a short story, or is there a kind of an underlying quality feature about the short story that makes it distinct and different from the novel. So that being the first question that I'd like to tackle and to discuss today, I think that the short story the size is of course one of the features, but that's not the main feature that distinguishes the short story from the novel, or for that matter a novelette as well. But the short story has at the center one basic problem that it tries to solve. It has a major problematic and everything around it, and everything, all incidents, characters, etc., they work towards the resolution of that problem. While in a novel you might see a kind of a slow gradual development of a character, the vast expanse of space in terms of time and space. The novel has that kind of range, that it can include as many characters and situations, incidents, episodes, and also characters who may not be central to the plot, right? And they might exist as a kind of a state of mind that the writer wants to project. But that is not the case in the short story. Short story has a sense of urgency in it. It is a kind of it always posits a kind of an arresting situation where where life, for instance, changes direction, or in another case, the real direction of life is found, right? So these are this becomes the mainstay of a story. In fact, in a story you cannot expect, for instance, the slow flowering of love, for instance, or a slow development of character. You have there is an immediate problem that requires resolution, and therefore the story could have these sudden illuminations or revelations of feeling and thought, and at the same time it could have these sudden disillusionments. So it is about a situation, a problem, an incident around which everything else revolves. So I think the short story therefore deals with an urgent problem, or a kind of a problem that requires urgent dealing with that issue. And it cannot, because of its limited scope and because of the number of words involved, it cannot delve deep into the character's psyche and show the gradual development of a character, etc. Right? So those are some of the things that it lacks. But on the other hand, I think there is a sense of urgency that gets attached to the story as compared to the novel. And of course, there have been a lot of discussions around this issue about the shortness of the short story, for instance, that how short would we call a story, and when does it turn into a novelette, and when does it become a novel. Now, you have Edgar Allan Poe, for instance, suggesting that something that can be read in 15 minutes is a short story. Now, that was an early definition of short story, that if you can read it in one go in 15 minutes, it's a short story. But short stories, we've come across now stories that are as short as 1 or 2 pages or as long as 50 pages, right? So and very soon they could turn, the moment they hit the 70-80 pages, you could call it a novelette, right? And this seems to be the story. So it's more like a kind of a grading, the shades, and you cannot restrict it as a short, something as a short story. While there may be, you might distinguish a short story from a novel, the in-between novelette, the moment it comes in, it becomes the kind of a bridge between a short story and a novel. So there is a kind of a relative definition of short story, and it is not really a fixed attribute that you associate with the short story. Right, and if you look at the screen, you will be able to see the quote that I was referring to of Edgar Allan Poe, who said that a short story, quite simply, was a narrative that can be read at one sitting. Right, so at one sitting meant, so does it also mean that the short story therefore is closer to the dramatic mode? Does it mean that it is closer to drama than to novel? Because there is an urgency attached to it, and it can be read in one go, at one sitting, as Edgar Allan Poe says. And he says, and as I quote from here, that in the whole composition there should be no word written of which the tendency, direct or indirect, is not to the one pre-established design. Now, for Poe, there is a pre-established design, which means that the pre-established pattern or a framework that the writer has thought out, and there shouldn't be any word or tendency, direct or indirect, that doesn't relate to that pattern or that design which is at the center of it. Would we then say that the short story is less spontaneous than the novel? And that is a question, because it is always falling in the pattern of a pre-designed or a pre-established design, and everything needs to fit in that pattern that the writer has established. So that also brings us to the question that is it more crafted in that sense? A lot of writers have suggested that writing a short story is actually more difficult than a novel, because you need to condense it because of the compactness of it, the compactness that you need to have in a story. And while brevity is the soul of the short story, you need to pack as much matter as possible in that brief moment, right? So these are some of the questions that we need to deal with, and as we discuss some of the stories, these answers might become more clear to us than otherwise we take them to be the case. So the short story then, I would say, presents a central case, a kind of central case or a central issue, and has characters associated with that issue. And unlike a novel where the perspective shifts, from one character to the other, and the writer hands the narrative to various characters in the novel, the short story actually limits its scope to the exploration of that one issue, and accompanied by these characters, by keeping the reader actually very close to the central character, or just one or two central characters. So this is how I think I'd like to open my discussion on the short story, as how it's distinct from the novel. Also, I'd like to add that the novel is a more hybrid term, as a kind of a melting pot where all other genres somehow fit into it. It can be poetic, it can include letter writing, journal writing, for instance, within its fold. It can also become symbolic and other things. So it has dialogue, so it can obviously create a dramatic situation through the use of those dialogues. So the novel in that sense is a hybrid of many literary forms, and it is a space where different voices and belief systems can continually collide, as the narrative progresses, but this collision in the short story is basically mostly on the essential issue that is pronounced in it. And the absence of hybridity, in fact, makes it more pronounced, I would say, because there are not too many collisions and not too many belief systems that are being countered and projected. The short story seems to focus on that one pronounced essential issue, and the absence of the many multiple sort of belief systems in a way highlights that one particular issue that the short story is trying to deal with at large. And the novel, then affords this kind of slow shaping of characters again. You see the character over a period of space and time, and the short story on the other hand is bound by these constraints. Things happen to characters, but within a limited period of time and space, and you only get, for instance, a glimpse of life in a short story. In fact, when I say the glimpse of life, I'd like you to, in fact, look at one more quotation in, where you have this, there are of course a lot of by now there are a lot of quotations and a lot of discussions around the short story as such, right? So when V.S. Pritchett, the writer, the short story writer, he in fact talked about this idea of the short story as something which is glimpsed from the corner of the eye. And if you just look at your screens, you will be able to see Raymond Carver, and he's also an American short story writer of the 20th century, who has observed about V.S. Pritchett the following. He says, Carver says that Pritchett's definition of a short story is something glimpsed from the corner of the eye in passing. So this is the quotation, of this kind of definition that Pritchett gives of a short story, that it is something glimpsed from the corner of the eye in passing. Now, Richard Carver is of course adding on his own discussion to it by suggesting that notice the glimpse part of this. First the glimpse, and then the glimpse gives life, turned into something that illuminates the moment. And the short story writer's task is to invest the glimpse with all that is in his power. He'll bring his intelligence and literary skills to bear, his talent, his sense of proportion, his sense of fitness of things, how things out there really are, and how he sees those things like no one else sees them. So, to come back to the question of glimpse really of life, and particularly glimpse from the corner of the eye, as if you see something in passing, and then you freeze that moment, right? And then that moment seems to speak for itself. So if you were to, it's almost like, you take a picture or a photograph of that moment, and you take that photograph out of life. And yet, I would not say that a short story is a photographic representation of life. I would say that it picks up one important seminal moment in the life of characters, as I said, some kind of a life-changing dynamic moment, and then there is a narrative that is woven around it. And when that narrative is woven, then you also find that certain details, are left hidden, for instance. And there is always a sort of a touch of mystery then, and some unanswered questions that remain in the short story. And that, I think, is also another very interesting feature of the short story, that it is very exploratory in nature, in the sense that the narrative can remain open-ended and doesn't require that kind of finality or a resolution that you see is built up in a novel. In a novel, you are taken to a climax slowly and you expect something to happen there. But the short story may, obviously there are writers who suggest that it must also have a climax and a moment which is a life-defining moment. And yet, the short story, because it leaves some questions unanswered, and there are hidden things that the writer probably doesn't even have the time or must pass by them because one would compromise on the compactness and the union or the unity of the story, and therefore the writer doesn't go into these digressions which are possible in the novel. So there is always this kind of a mystery or a hidden truth that remains there in the short story. And in fact, there is this writer, Etchy Bates, the English writer, who actually goes on to talk about the short story as a more reader-centric experience than the novel. In fact, the reader has more control on the short story than one has in the novel. Now, that's an interesting thing. Note this quote that you find that Etchy Bates gave to the preface of his selected stories. And I'll just quote for you this particular quote. And Etchy Bates says, "In the art of the short story, the contribution demanded of the reader is greater, more subtle than that demanded in the novel. The reader must search beyond the printed page and explain for himself those things that the writer, in the restraint of his craft, has only partially revealed." Unquote. Now, what is this thing that is partially revealed? And what does Etchy Bates mean by the story as being more subtle? The demands on the reader are more subtle when it comes to the story, as much so than the demand on the reader as far as the novel is concerned, because the novel is almost like the reader is spoon-fed, according to Etchy Bates, while the reader must search beyond the printed page as far as the short story is concerned and explain unto oneself those things that the writer has kept a secret, or the writer has not gone or has restrained in his craft and has only partially revealed. So I think that's a very interesting take on the short story, and I'd like Professor Prakash to actually discuss this point, whether he thinks that the short story is more subtle, or is it or in fact it is more superficial. I mean, the idea would be that because the short story is short in form, it doesn't have depth, etc., it would be more crude in that sense, or maybe if not crude, then at least not as would lack depth that probably the novel has. Here, Etchy Bates seems to suggest that the demands on the reader are more subtle because there is more exploration involved in the story than there is in the novel. How do you look at this?
Well, you have already given a very good introduction to the issue of the short story and its distinction from other forms of literature, other forms of writing, and you have touched upon some very sharp points, in the course of your discussion. I would say that the point that you are emphasizing in the beginning is the point of short story having focus and the novel not having the focus. And the moment you talk about the focus, you talk about the eye, you talk about the corner of the eye, you talk about the glimpse. All this terminology is the terminology of the eye, which means that what you see in front of you is what you seek to capture in the short story. So this point should take me, for instance, as a curious reader of the short story, into other senses that we have, like sound, like touch, or like sensuousness. When you are stuck to the page, you use the word freeze also there, that particular moment is frozen into the form of the short story, then it ceases to be that kind of sensuous literary entity that it might be so far as to the writing of Etchy Bates, who is a contemporary writer and who is a practitioner of this form, apart from the longer fiction. So this is one point that occurs to me straight away. And the other point is that the short story has an element of, this is a new point, and I really appreciate the way you say it, that short story is controlled by the reader. That you always have in mind the expectation that the reader has from you, and you are in a way playing with him or her. The reader, you want to show and you don't want to show, and you want to make him or her think, and at the same time you want to hide your intent. So it's a kind of a seesaw game between the writer and the reader. So that's another good point that you have made. And in fact, I would like to ask a counter question from you. You have written short stories. Were you aware of all these things when you were writing those short stories?
I would say no. I wasn't aware of these dimensions while writing the story, because while writing the story, I think the writer is equally arrested in that moment, and the endeavor is to be able to put it across on the page. So because you are so arrested in that moment, and the moment compels you to bring certain things together, and to put them together to make a sort of a connection between things, you know. And I think these are things that we can discuss from the outside, and it would be in fact erroneous to think that the writer is thinking of all these things and then sitting to write a piece of short story, because the short story, maybe from the point of view of literateurs and scholars of literature, we can look at it now from a distance and try to divide it into categories of all kinds.
Which is not the case with novel writing. There you can stop, you can think, you can plan. But here you are caught in the moment, and the moment then compels you to go in a certain direction.
Right. So it's something which needs to be taken to its required end. You know, so you cannot stop. Even the writer cannot stop midway and think and go back. That editing might come in later at this as a kind of a second stage. But I don't think that the writer in the moment has the capacity to let go of that moment, because in that moment the writer needs to create, and to put it out there it must have a sense of, again I use the word urgency, because there is a sense of taking it to its required climax, and you cannot let go of it. So I think that is the main point of the discussion here, that you cannot let go of that moment, that you must handhold that moment that you are trying to capture and take it to its climax, and only then leave it.
I can also ask the question, and I'm equally asking from the listeners and from myself. Is a short story controlled by its ending? Because already you are taking it from an experience to a particular point, and you're not bothered about the periphery anywhere.
Right. No, I think that the short story is, for instance, Cyril Dabadine says that he's written, in fact, an article. He says that the short story as process and not what it means. So in that case, I don't think he thought the short story to be driven by its climax. But I do think that the short story, as it begins, it is always moving towards something, you know, and that there is an idea behind it from the very beginning. So that idea is not, of course, a gradual exploration or a gradual development. Things happen fast in the short story. There is speed, and the speed is an element in the story. You need to get to the point fast enough, and you cannot even have a detailed descriptions, physical descriptions, as you might in a novel. But I think that there is a driving point that is taking the story in its natural forward direction. So if we want to say that whether the climax actually determines it, I think the climax is that essential issue that the writer is trying to deal with, or is able to see. When we say a glimpse, then the writer is able to see in that moment that idea. And the journey then for the writer is to move from that what one sees and to take the reader to that idea. So the writer, he or she, has to complete this journey from what one sees, the glimpse of it, and the idea that one has captured, that has been only captured by the writer. So it is the writer's truth, the writer's interpretation of that moment that we actually see in the short story. So the task of the writer is to take the reader from that glimpse to that essential idea, that journey. So in that sense, the process is equally important, and therefore in this process, there is nothing then superfluous that is left in the story, I would say, in that sense.
You also touched on the point of the character in a short story, and now you are talking about the writer, and you are talking about the process and about the experience and the focus. What is the role of the character in a short story? One or two characters, if they are there.
Right. You see, I think characters in a short story, again, there has been a lot of discussion. For instance, Somerset Maugham was against the very idea of some of the critics who noted that characters it is a character that is important in a story, and incidents are secondary to it, and incidents appear only to liven the personality of the character. So he said that that's not true, because the incident is the main thing. So there is a lot of discussion on the 19th century bent was based on this kind of building up of the character. So I think the character incident is a kind of a goose chase really, that keeps going on, whether what is more important between the two. But for me, a short story has always an issue and a problematic, and for that both incidents and characters are required to fulfill that promise of the writer or that issue.
So friends, in this part of the discussion, we have been compelled to face a situation where there are lots of questions, lots of versions, and the reader as well as the writer would be at a loss to find out what exactly is the essence of the short story. So maybe as the discussion proceeds further, we'll be able to see the clarification of these points, if any clarification is actually possible. So wait till that moment, and we come back, with the extension of this argument further to enlighten ourselves and you. Thank you.